This speaker, our speaker is Michael Fowler, who's the author of Calling the Fleeting Breath, Glimpses of Abraham Lincoln's Personage Through Art and Material Culture. So Michael is a professor of design and the holder of the Mary Durbin Toole Chair in Art at the University of South Carolina at Aiken. This is where he teaches fine art and graphic design. He is an accomplished artist himself. Michael has exhibited his work in regional and national shows. His landscape paintings can be found in public and private collections around the nation. Michael will discuss Lincoln through art and material culture using the perspectives of 4 different time periods. Lincoln's life, especially 1854 to 1865, comes under Lincoln tested. Following his assassination, a battle fought for how to remember him in Lincoln Promoted, 1865 to 1930. And Lincoln Elevated, 1917 to 1945. Lincoln reaches historic mythical status. Then in Lincoln Transfigured, 1946 to the present, Lincoln's memory sees a reevaluation in the context of the civil rights movement, changes in presidential authority. Here, Fowler will discuss how Lincoln's enduring legacy is expressed through art. This will be an eye-opening experience as Michael promises to show us much that we haven't seen before. So with that,
I'm very honored to be here. I keep my volume up so you all can hear, hopefully. I apologize. I had plans to put these on an easel. If you're not able to see, you might want to adjust your seating. I may try to pull them over here, but I had this brilliant idea of having visuals in pairs, and I did not want to do PowerPoint. I want, whenever possible, to have actual presence. John was asking a Zoom. I said, you know, like Lincoln, I like to press the flesh. I like to be in the presence of. I'm very much in tune, and I had students that we had to, go remote at the beginning of the COVID. I had this A student, and she was just at a loss. She said, I can't handle this. Please help me. There is something about the immediacy that I really cherish and value in the classroom. I teach a variety of fine art and graphic design. I'm on the computer a good bit, but I like the hands-on stuff. The first 2 pair of images will relate to this idea of visual art being a language. And there is I don't know if you have heard much about material culture or whatever, but Jules Brown is a pioneer in material culture. And material culture just has to do with things in the material world that we can identify with that, and you probably have mementos yourself. And I may be asking you to be thinking about a memento that you cherish, that has spoken to you. There's a language implied with these objects that we've inherited or cherish that speak to us. There is a language. And he said there's a language of form as well as a language of words. Naming through making as there is a naming through saying. Naming through making as there is a naming through saying. So I wanted to open, now this is on one of the first double-page spreads in my book. We were discussing Frank Porcu's wonderful sculptures. He was at the Lincoln Forum. He had this, I think it was larger than life, isn't it? Bust of Lincoln. And then he had ones that he was working, took a clump of clay and put it on the end of a pencil and was doing his sculpture. He's academically trained, classically trained sculptor, and teaches at Columbia and adjuncts at Cooper Union as well. Fascinating fellow to talk to. Anyway, so I chose to use a reproduction of one of his sculptures at the beginning of the book, accompanied by, and Thomas Gray's elegy written in the country churchyard. Does that sound familiar? That Lincoln referred to in an kind of an epigraph. It was pressed by the biographers to supply something of his background, the short and simple annals of the poor. Well, I took a page from Douglas Wilson's book, Honor's Voice. He also went to that source for the title of his book. And I came across this passage from Gray's Elegy, "Can storied urn or animated bust back to its mansion call the fleeting breath?" And there's something about that whole poem that encourages us to honor the memory of people that have gone on before. There is a value to that. And I thought to use that phrase, calling the fleeting breath, implies something of memories that may be fugitive, but they're no the less important. And when I noticed Frank Bourque, and I chose this before I even met him, and I discovered that he was at the Lincoln Forum, there's something about, what do you notice in this sculpture that to you maybe says something about being animated? The tie is loose, the hair's blown. Of course, Lincoln didn't know anything else besides windblown hair, right? Or fingers through the hair. But I saw that and it captured my imagination. I said, this seems like a perfect way to introduce my book and this concept of art as a language. There's how many thousand books on Lincoln? And how many, maybe hundreds, that are illustrated biographies, which is great. But a lot of times we look at something and notice what the subject matter is and then move on, instead of maybe pausing to consider, what is it about that? How was that image made? Or how was that painting or sculpture done? What kind of materials were used? And this terracotta bust, the medium, and if you've worked with clay yourself, you know how plastic it is, how it's given to human touch, and how that communicates an immediacy and a liveliness. And so I really wanted to key in on that and get us thinking about, no, this is not just an illustrated book of illustrations, photographs and whatever about Lincoln, but it's going to give us some insights into ways that artists have portrayed Lincoln in different media, and in doing that, it causes a communication that maybe we need to take some time to ponder and realize, the importance. Like this painting, I spoke with Norman Rockwell's grandson to get permission to zoom in and get a close-up view from his grandfather's painting of Lincoln for the Defense. You've probably seen this whole, sorry. It's about 1.5 feet wide and about 4 feet high. I don't know, had you seen the painting before in reproduction? This was on, I think, McCall's magazine, 1962. Lincoln defending his relative from New Salem days. Duff Armstrong is accused in the back of the table. And yes, it's powerful, and it's good to be able to see the whole image and be reminded of Lincoln's long legs, if you were. But the way he's holding the evidence that will help prove that this murder occurred at nighttime, and it wasn't a full moon. Couldn't have known, that who was the one that he's not accused of being of murdering. But I wanted to zoom in on this part because I wanted to have Lincoln's facial expression, the high contrast angular frame that he's holding the almanac, and I guess you could call that a piece of material culture. But he's using that as a reference to help prove that this Duff Armstrong was innocent. It's not murder. And then I chose to arrange it with the title there. And I wanted to use something that was a little bit, I guess you could say, obtuse, to give a clue that, no, this is not just an illustrated book on Lincoln, it's just as good as many of those are. And I'm really, in fact, I've thought about bringing it. One of my early influences was Stephen Lawrence, 1957, book in this illustrated biography. So I wanted to show this pairing here as a way to just highlight the importance of art as a visual language. So my artistic background was one source of inspiration for this book. And I thought, really, this aspect of Lincoln's life has not been written about. Examples have been shown, and we've seen plenty of artwork, but have these been opportunities for us to pause and take note of why things are looking the way they do? Another source of inspiration happened almost 60 years ago. I'll pass this around. I know you've seen campaign tickets before. My grandmother brought me into the dining room when I was about 12 years old, and she set this big leather-bound scrapbook on the table and opened it up. My wife and I try to keep our scrapbooks intact, even though our daughters wanted to borrow this for this project or whatever. Said, no, keep it intact. But she took a pair of scissors and she cut out this campaign ticket from the scrapbook from her great aunt. And she gave it to me for safekeeping. Really? A teenage boy? Taking a chance there, but I've always valued this. And to me, you talk about mementos speaking to you. This speaks to me and has spoken and got me interested in exploring more about the life of Lincoln. On my way here, going by the Dulles Airport exit, I was remembering back in '66, we landed at the Dulles Airport. It's our first trip back east. I'm from California, fourth generation. My ancestors on my mom's side were gold rushers, and they earned enough in the gold rush to start an orchard, something a little more stable, but in the county next over from where Sutter's Ford is. And so that's kind of my heritage. But to have something that she thought enough to put in a scrapbook, and then my grandmother to entrust me with that, I said, there's something to this here. Maybe I need to take note or whatever. But I started out just being fascinated with Lincoln's appearance and descriptions of the way he walked and how he handled himself, his sense of humor. Of course, got interested in the assassination, taking books to school and explaining about these different aspects of Lincoln's life and circumstances around his death and so forth. But you know how it is when you start reading about Lincoln and you learn about Lincoln, not just from historians, but sociologists, art historians, and of quite a variety of different people with different perspectives. It just like Carl Sandburg said, the son of a gun grows on you. All this opportunity for all these writers, that keep writing about it from different, perspectives. It's just, it's just, where do you plumb the depths of this man and his character? And Rockwell very much admired Lincoln through the 6 decades of his painting life. There was at least 1 or 2 Lincoln paintings every decade. He was fascinated with his character, his sense of humor, his nobility, and just learning about how others have appreciated his character. It does underscore the importance that this man has and continues to have. And you hear all these current activities going on that have to do with the Lincoln, and there's just no end. It's just wonderful. Okay, so this pair of images, I went ahead and set out some things, including the campaign ticket. I guess this was what dropped in the ballot box. This has the California electors on it. I was mistaken. My aunt was from Ohio, immigrated from Ohio, but in the 1850s went to California. But this is California, so that it has a California. And so thanks to James Cornelius, who was one of the helpful proofreaders of my of my book. I've got a Lincoln medal, and this print was done on milk glass. And here's an inscription from Carl Sandburg in his prairie years. So I just assembled these things together to show some of my collection. Well, about 40 years after my initial interest, I decided to take a picture. The inspiration for this book specifically came when I was looking for an image to go on the cover of an invitation my wife and I were sending out for a dinner invitation. We'd serve Kentucky burgoo. Y'all had Kentucky burgoo and chicken fricassee. And we have these people over and serve the period food and say, hey, come and bring something Lincolnian with you. Well, I wanted to have a lighthearted image. I started looking for images of Lincoln, got me thinking, boy, you know, there's a lot here that I haven't seen before. And I kind of wonder how many others there are. The university funded me going around the country. So I had a 10,000-mile road trip around visiting to be able to see firsthand these images and jot down notes and take picture and meet with these wonderful people that hosted me, had me in their home. And, you know, it's just, well, you know how it is with other Lincoln folks. So anyway, so I wanted to show this invitation. It's just, and I brought it out again for the 196th. But looking for that image got me started, and that was 22 years ago. How long did it take you? The dean of the college, how many years did it take you to write this book? I said 21. I said, 21 years? Are you kidding me? What took you so long? I'm slow. But it's been a joy for the most part. I mean, you have these good memories of associations. And any of you, and you know, seems like a lot of you in this room are authors, right? Have written as well, and you know how it can really, you know, seize you and hold you. I want to show these two images. This one of campaign badges and little lapel pins, and there was such a glut. And for some reason, I guess it was the numismatic interest, and they had gone from a large cent down to a small cent. Well, during that time, there were a lot of these medals minted not just for Lincoln's campaign, but for businesses that were wanting to promote their business. But there's something about this, a campaign medal, and they were made in at least 5 different metals, and there are hundreds of thousands of them as giveaways. You know, of course, now they're really valuable. But having one of these maybe dollar-sized coins in your pocket, you know, you've got a piece of Lincoln, right? It's that material form, or wearing a piece on your lapel. And it put me in mind of my dad served in Chinese theater, World War II. Early on, and he worked from mosquito control. I started thinking, okay, Lincoln was complaining about mosquitoes in the Black Hawk War, right? Well, Dad had this silver dollar. Chiang Kai-shek was on one side. By the time I got to see it, you know, in the 50s, 60s, so forth, well, that image started getting worn. He carried it around with him everywhere. And I still remember the sound of that silver, you know, clinking against his pocket knife and other coin change, you know, and he'd bring out his pocket knife to cut you know, when the yo-yos get too tight around your finger and starts cutting the circulation off. But that he carried that with him, and that was, you know, a memento that spoke to him. Who has a memento you've been thinking now? Memento that you'd like to share that you've received from an ancestor and cherished somehow? Anybody want to share something you've received that? Yeah.
Yeah, actually, it's sort of unusual. It didn't come from the family, but I got presented a little, about a 6-inch tall cross that glows in the dark. And, you know, I probably had a good attendance at Sunday school.
Okay.
But anyway, I kept that through the years, and my father made a little base for it, and particularly after I took it with me when I was on a trip to Italy in high school, and I actually attended the Easter Mass at St. Peter's with Pope Paul VI. And he was going like this, And so I held it up and it got blessed. Well, anyway, so when I got back, and with the other story is that this is the first year that the Easter Mass was televised in the US. And after I got back, my parents said, we thought I was standing by a telephone pole. And my parents said, we thought we saw someone who looked like you standing by a telephone pole. So they saw me on television. But anyway, I've kept this dog through all my US Air Force assignments. And I thought I misplaced it, but I found it recently. It had been broken in half, but I glued it. And now I have it the size of my bed. And it still glows in the dark.
Thank you for sharing. Oh, yeah. It's a wonderful story. But just to impress us that there are things that speak to us. And, you know, they start attaching memories to them. Well, I've got the campaign tokens and medals on one illustration, and I bookended that toward the end of Lincoln's presidency. This is his work as a graphic designer. He took and had a galley proof printed of his second inaugural, but then took it and with a penknife or scissors or something, cut it into pieces. You've probably seen reproductions of this. I did a facsimile of this just for an exhibit I had on Lincoln's last months. But why do you suppose he clipped these sentences and phrases and put them on this piece of cardboard? This is what he read from, and by adjusting the spaces between the sentences and phrases allowed him to give emphasis where he intended. And it's got some of his own marks and the paste, you know, marks, that kind of thing. But I thought, you know, it's so easy for us just to digitally, you know, move things around in here, but, you know, this manual effort just to make sure that he gave emphasis where he intended as he was speaking to these thousands at the second inaugural. But again, that's a physical, visual that he used. I lived in Lincoln, Nebraska for the duration of my time working on my Master of Fine Arts in painting. And I don't know how well you can see this, but at the base of this, it's a 400-foot tall Capitol building in Lincoln that was named after him 2 years after his assassination. His sculpture is kind of in the middle here in place, but this is a clay model. Lee Lowry was the sculptor. It's called Lincoln the Great Emancipator. This was done in the early 1930s. And during that time, in a lot of Lincoln sculptures were youthful, the youthful Lincoln, smooth skin and, you know, this kind of thing that was a little departure from the truth, but there's idealistic sculptures. And I can't imagine being 150 feet up and carving this in place, you know, in Indiana limestone and all. But I'd walk by this every day on my way to classes at the university. We lived in an apartment on the other side of the building. But I bring that up to point out a couple of things. The idealism, and you've probably seen the Hoosier Youth, Fort Wayne, Indiana, and then there was another seated, beardless sculpture, Lincoln by his dog, and then has an axe on one side and a book in his hand. And it's very smooth and idealized surface. That seemed to be the kind of go along with what the Art Deco period of the 30s, and that sense of idealism during the struggles during the Depression. So, unlike the very, and that sculpture was done about a decade before the dedication of the Lincoln Memorial in 41 at Mount Rushmore. And this Gutzen Borglum, the sculptor of the Mount Rushmore Lincoln, also did this bronze casting, but now Lincoln is seated. And in a way, I don't know if you can see in the inset, there's little children from the neighborhood that would, you know, sit around and beside him and be on top of him, and have that very accessible Lincoln as opposed to one that is high up and far away. in Newark, New Jersey. I think that's New Jersey. The next to last sculpture I'm going to show, and I'm a painter, but I'm showing sculptures as well. This also at the Capitol building in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he's standing in front of the entablature of the Gettysburg Address, and it was in the intention of Daniel Chester French, who did the seated Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial, and this is about 10 years before that, to do a standing Lincoln that specified his posture just before he gave the Gettysburg Address. And someone that had witnessed that was there at Gettysburg, was saying, you got it right. This is the way he was standing before he gave the address. I know he was seated for a time as well, but a very expressive face and a focus on his hands and all. At the other end of the 3-block mall to the west, in front of the county building in Lincoln, is this sculpture here, Louis Slobodkin, 1939, and it was commissioned by the WPA, and this was to be a part of the New York World's Fair. It was originally intended as a release sculpture, but the artist decided to do a full in the round piece. And I wanted to share some of Slobodkin's work. Now, you say, well, that doesn't look much like Lincoln. But there was a reason for the abstraction. And I wanted to share the this is called Abraham Lincoln, the Rail Joiner. We know him as a rail splitter, but now what do you suppose the significance of being a rail joiner would be? Joining North and South, the Union. Less the outward appearance of Lincoln and more the idea of energy and dynamism. That's more a symbol for this specific time during our nation's lingering Great Depression, expressing universal concepts of strength and determination. Stylized after ancient Greek Korai sculptures, fought against the enemy, protect the state, abstracted bodily perfection, and aspiration for their citizens' ideals. The nation unifying legacy through joining the North and South rails expresses Lincoln's contributions towards civil liberties in the forming of America's more perfect union. Well, you know, Lincoln's chest wasn't this bulky, right? Have you been to the museum in Springfield and see? My wife was saying, amazed. She said, must not even be 8 inches from front to back of his chest, and yet the incredible strength that he had to hold the axe out, arm's length, that no one else could do. But again, idealized and, you know, expressing that sense of strength and vigor, even the style of the way that the sculptor is made, with the texture of the clothing. I want to close with these two images here. I don't know if you can see what this is. Yeah, it's a washboard. And I'm sorry, the contrast isn't too great, but there's a pair of black gloves that are wrapped around the lower supports of the washboard. Malika Favorite, who used to live just across the river from me in Augusta, Georgia. She was a school teacher and a poet, but she decided to have a series called The Washing of America. And so she chose Lincoln and his words as something that would be expressive of that initiative that he had. And this is called, as I would not be a slave, so I would not be a master. Are you familiar with that quote? She wrote this, and I was talking to her about her intention. She did other series that related to Lincoln as well, but this is what she wrote about this piece. The washboard to me is an item that brings back memories of my mother as she did our family laundry. As a poet and artist, I see words as visual and verbal statements. I want my artwork to lead people on a journey that encourages reading by combining visual images with words. I ask the viewer to read to better understand what the work is about. The words remain with them because the art acts as a mental carrying case that locks the words in a memorable context. And I know you're probably familiar with Richard Wangenroth's paintings of different aspects of Lincoln Personae. He was glad to be a part of the book. I had a conversation with him when I visited his studio back early 2000s. This is his Gettysburg Lincoln, and of course you've got the innumerable tombstones in the background. Before he came across Lincoln and became fascinated with Lincoln and his character, he was a landscape painter and tried to work the two elements, Lincoln's personality and landscapes, together somehow. But he came up with these huge, the original is actually bigger than that. It's about 3.5 feet across, about 5 feet tall. And some of you may have seen those early on at the Lincoln Forum. He wanted to express Lincoln's profound sorrow and grief. But the artist also intended the overriding content in the portrait to be Lincoln's reaction to the staggering human losses and the burden of personal responsibility during the Civil War, in his words. His use of color serves as one example. The painting, he said, highlights raw umbers and browns to evoke mud, urine, and excrement. His deep reds and burnt siennas, of course, to represent blood and wounds. Greens and purples, putrefaction and gangrene. The paint drippings are fully intended, evocative of bloody, damaged, and suffering bodies. But he adds, they also remind the viewer that whatever else this image may be, it is also a painting, a handcrafted painting, and should be seen in that art context as well as an historical one. So, and I thought it was important, and where possible, the artists still living wanted to make sure to capture their intentions in their own words. So that's very much a part of my book as well. So hopefully these highlights will be a good reminder for us to, instead of just seeing, oh, I can tell what that is, and we move on, that we pause and we maybe take the second and third look to learn something about the medium that's used to make that image. Thank you very much.
A few questions, if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, can you hold up the copy of this book?
I was thankful, even though this is self-published. I mean, I tried. But I said, I need to do this before I die. I need to go ahead. I don't want this to be a post-mortem publication. So I went ahead and looked into self-publishing. And in a sense, I'm really glad that in doing that, I was able to have complete control over the layout. And since I'm a graphic designer, opportunity, because otherwise you're giving it over to someone else. Yeah, you may really like their work, but it's not yours, kind of thing. So I was glad to be able to, and like I've paired these, a lot of the 2-page spreads are pairings for comparison, contrast, or whatever, just to increase appreciation. If you've had artistic classes, you can remember that.
Yeah, I'm curious how people's reactions were to this artwork right after Lincoln's death. It's the first decade or two. Just as an aside, many years ago, Craig and I don't know if he remembers this, we're traveling through Cincinnati, Ohio to go to the Underground Railroad, or museum, which just opened. And we had to find a park, in Cincinnati, small park of a Lincoln. And Robert Todd Lincoln said that that's the worst statue of Abraham Lincoln that he's ever seen. This is after the Civil War, I don't know how many decades it took.
Right.
And we looked at it, and I had binoculars, and it looked pretty good to me. I don't know what Craig thought. So I'm curious about the reaction that people had the first 10 or 20 years to the material culture that was going on, rather than now, many years later.
Right. Well, that's an interesting point. I just hinted at it with the sculptures on the Capitol building in Lincoln, Nebraska, that tended to be more idealized and all, which is something that I know Lincoln's son Robert appreciated. The St. Gaudens Lincoln in Lincoln Park in Chicago, for example, very stately, formal, that kind of thing. And then you've got George Gray Barnard, who did a sculpture of standing Lincoln, and it looked like his feet are too big and his hands kind of awkward, and he's really rough looking. But really, the proportions were probably pretty close to being accurate. But there seemed to be those that preferred the more idealized versus the more earthy and realistic.
Yeah, he had a very negative thought of that statue, and it didn't look any odd at
Right.
all. It looked like
Right.
a good statue. So
Yeah.
that was his personal reaction. I'm sure other people had their
Sure.
own personal reactions. to
Sure.
Lincoln.
Yeah. And sometimes, like in the Slobodkin sculpture, look at that, really, it doesn't look like Lincoln, but once you learn something about the background and the intent the artist had and the sources that he drew from for inspiration and the time when it's done, to be this very energetic, dynamic looking figure that is helping to give us positive thoughts about during the Depression, for example.
I think there's a piece here that's kind of interesting. The time, we put some work on study on the Rodin at the École de Julien, at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so he picked up from that particular workshop a realistic trend that was for the time, which was a break. Because there was a time of great social change. So before, you had these idealistic views.
Right. Right.
And you can see this in Washington, D.C. in the statues. But something about the Civil War and the invention of photography brought in these aspects of realism, harsh, cold realism. And
Good
so
point.
what is truly magnificent about Borglum and Dardenne and Chester French is that they're able to bring out the realism, but to bring the vision that the man had, the determination, the focus.
Right.
So when you look at Lincoln's face in a lot of these sculptures, I see the overriding thing is the vision in his eyes, the intensity. And maybe careworn, his
Sure.
clothing is rumpled, his hands are gnarled,
Yeah.
but the vision is clear. And
Well said.
that's the influence of the French and the Italian sculptors. Because the French, Chester French, they gave me what they call the failed exam. And then they said, oh, well, I'll go to the Atelier, which is a side school. And there were tons of them in Paris. And then he said, well, I really don't need to be here. I need to be in Italy learning sculpture. So then he went to Italy. And that's where he honed his sculpture skills. And yet it was Elwood Longman, who was an artist who did all the garlands on the Lincoln Memorial, who insisted that Lincoln's statue be large. It was going to be a little dinky.
I know, they had planned it at 10 feet. And I said, no.
And she said, she looked at it more, and she's the one that pressed. No, this has to be larger than life. This is Lincoln. You guys spend the money and
Yeah.
get it right.
Yeah.
And she's a friend of Chester French. She won her commission anonymously in an anonymous competition. She was a well-known artist, extremely accomplished. And so she was well established as a good friend. She too had studied in Paris. What was her name? Elwood Longman. She's the unknown artist. When you go to Lincoln, you see all the eagles and the carol and the garlands. That's very Rico de Beaux-Arts. The garlands and the flowers. That's.
I'll say, thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I'm enriched.
You helped me think this through. What's the connection? Why is it that whenever I see a Lincoln statue, I'm like,
I know.
And I visited the Lincoln Memorial hundreds of times with, eighth graders.
Sure.
Tours. And each time I'm never in Europe. I'm always astounded at how people get inspired. And there's this activity around the memorial. Even when Donald Trump came there. Even when the president came there, it's Lincoln.
Maybe
Thanks
one
so
more-
much for
one more
sharing.
question.
I was wondering, what is the most surprising image or the most surprising thing you learned in your research that surprised you the most?
Well, the Slobodkin sculpture would rank right up there. There's also a painting by a South Carolina artist, William Johnson, that portrayed Lincoln across the table from Frederick Douglass, and the pairing and the document on a table. And in the background, there's a lynching, and there's also a freedman with a knapsack going his way. That to me, it should be a highlight too. But and his wife encouraged him, you've got to get back to your roots and paint in the style that you grew up knowing and are familiar with, because he had gone to Paris, gone overseas to study, but then came back to his roots, so to speak. And, it was that style that resonated as such a distinctive style. And I think the Museum of American Art here in DC, it's a painting on paper. But again, it's nothing like you've seen these things firsthand, just to be able to see this. Oh, this is wonderful. You can only go so far with reproduction in a book, right? But anyway, thank you all.
Thank you very much.